Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. I'm a landscape architect, have been for about 15 years now. I specialize in residential design, mostly working with wealthy homeowners who want their yards to look like something out of a magazine. It pays well, but I'd been renting a tiny apartment forever because property prices in our area are absolutely insane. When this house came on the market, I knew I had to have it. The house itself was nice enough, a modest 3-bedroom built in the 70s, but what really caught my eye was the land. The lot was massive, nearly 2 acres, and shaped like a long rectangle. The house sat at the front of the property, with the backyard stretching almost 200 yards toward the main road. Most importantly, the entire side of the property ran right up against the entrance to our town's most popular public park. During the walkthrough, the elderly seller mentioned something about neighbors using part of the yard as a shortcut, but I honestly didn't think much of it. He was in his 80s, seemed a bit confused, and kept talking about how quiet and peaceful everything would be once I moved in. The realtor brushed off his comments too. We figured he was just being overly friendly with the neighbors. Boy, were we wrong. I closed on the house on a Friday in early March, spent the weekend moving my stuff in, and by Monday morning I was settling into my home office to work on a design for a client's backyard renovation. That's when I heard voices outside my window. Then footsteps. Then more voices. I looked out and saw a woman walking past my living room window with 2 golden retrievers off their leashes. She waved at me like we were old friends. I waved back, thinking maybe she was just being neighborly, but then I watched her continue straight across my side yard toward the park entrance. Over the next hour, I saw at least a dozen people do the exact same thing. Families with kids, joggers, dog walkers, even a guy on a bicycle. They were all cutting directly across my property, following what looked like a well-worn dirt path that ran from the street, across about 10 feet of my side yard and straight to the park entrance. I called the realtor to ask what the hell was going on. She sounded genuinely surprised and said she'd never heard anything about a public path through the property. She promised to look into it and get back to me. That afternoon, I walked outside to examine the path more closely. It was clear this had been going on for years. The grass was completely worn away in a strip about 8 feet wide, and there were even some wooden stepping stones someone had placed over the muddy spots. This wasn't just neighbors cutting through occasionally. This was basically a public walkway that happened to run through my yard. The realtor called back that evening. She'd spoken to the previous owner's son, who explained the situation. Apparently, the old man had been letting people use this shortcut for over 30 years. The park entrance was designed to be accessed from the main road, but if you parked on our street, you'd have to walk almost half a mile down to the corner and back up the main road to reach it. Cutting across this little strip of his yard saved everyone a lot of time and effort. The son was apologetic and said his father should have mentioned it during the sale, but honestly, the old guy probably forgot. He'd been dealing with early-stage dementia for the past few years. The realtor offered to help me figure out how to handle the situation, but legally speaking, it was my property now and I could do whatever I wanted with it. That first week, I tried to be understanding. These people had been using this path for decades. It wasn't their fault the previous owner hadn't told me about it. Plus, they seemed harmless enough. Most of them were families heading to the park with their kids, or people walking their dogs, or fitness groups using the walking trails. But by the second week, the novelty wore off completely. I work from home, and having a constant stream of strangers walking past my windows was incredibly distracting. The dogs were the worst part. People would let them run loose on my property, and I'd regularly find poop in my yard that their owners hadn't bothered to clean up. The final straw came when I looked out one morning and saw a woman letting her toddler use my garden as a bathroom. When I tapped on the window and shook my head, she actually had the nerve to shrug and give me a "what else am I supposed to do" gesture. That weekend, I drove to the garden center and bought 30 thorny barberry shrubs. Barberry is perfect for creating natural barriers because it's dense, fast-growing, and covered in sharp spines that make it extremely unpleasant to push through. I spent Saturday and Sunday planting them in a neat line along the worn path, creating what I thought was a clear and attractive boundary. The shrubs were small when I planted them, only about 2 feet high, but they'd grow quickly, and within a few months would form an impenetrable hedge. I also put up a few small signs that said "private property" and "please use park entrance on main road." For about 3 weeks, my plan worked perfectly. The foot traffic stopped almost immediately. People would walk up to the hedge, see the signs, and turn around to use the actual park entrance. A few people seemed annoyed, but most just shrugged and walked the extra distance. I was feeling pretty proud of myself for handling the situation so diplomatically. The hedge looked great. It was a reasonable solution that didn't involve confrontation, and everyone seemed to be respecting the boundary. I should have known it was too good to last. On a Thursday morning in early April, I was working in my office when I heard the sound of branches snapping outside. I looked out the window and couldn't believe what I was seeing. A woman in expensive yoga pants and a designer visor was standing in the middle of my hedge with a pair of professional-grade pruning shears, systematically cutting a hole through it. I ran outside immediately. The woman looked to be in her early 60s, with that particular combination of athletic wear and jewelry that screams suburban entitlement. She had already cut through about half the hedge and was working on widening the gap to make it more comfortable to walk through. When she saw me coming, she didn't stop what she was doing. She didn't even look embarrassed. Instead, she straightened up and gave me a look like I was the one being unreasonable. "What are you doing to my hedge?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm fixing your mistake," she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You blocked the path. I'm trying to restore it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This is my yard. That's not a path, it's my property. You're trespassing and destroying my plants." She laughed, actually laughed, and shook her head like I was being ridiculous. "Don't be silly, this is a public right-of-way. Everyone has been using it for 30 years. You can't just block it off." "It's not a public right-of-way," I said, my patience starting to wear thin. "It's private property. My private property. You need to leave right now." "I don't think so," she said, and went back to cutting. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 25 years. I know what's public and what's private. This path has always been here." I stood there for a moment, completely stunned by her audacity. She was literally destroying my landscaping while telling me I didn't have the right to control my own property. I told her again that she needed to leave, and that if she didn't stop cutting my hedge, I was going to call the police. "Go ahead and call them," she said without looking up. "I'll be happy to explain to them how you're trying to block a public easement." I went inside and did exactly that. While I waited for the police to arrive, I watched her finish cutting a nice, neat opening through my hedge, test it by walking through a few times, and then actually take out her phone to call someone and let them know the path was open again. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later. By then, the woman had finished her vandalism and was standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, waiting for me to come outside. I met the police at my front door with a folder containing my property survey, deed, and closing documents. The first officer was a middle-aged guy who seemed like he'd dealt with property disputes before. I showed him my survey and explained the situation. The property line was clearly marked, and my hedge was well within my own land. There was no easement, public or otherwise, listed in any of the documentation. The woman, who I later learned was known around the neighborhood simply as Karen, tried to interrupt several times to explain about the 30-year easement and how she had prescriptive rights to use the path. It was obvious she'd been doing some Googling about property law, but she clearly didn't understand what she was talking about. The officer was polite but firm. He explained that just because the previous owner had allowed people to cross his property didn't create any kind of legal right for them to continue doing so once the property changed hands. He told her that she was trespassing and needed to use the actual park entrance from now on. Karen was furious. Her face turned bright red, and she started talking about calling her lawyer and filing complaints with the town. She demanded to know my name so she could take action against me for blocking public access. The officer told her that was her right, but for now she needed to stay off my property or she could be arrested for trespassing. After they left, I spent the rest of the afternoon replanting the section of hedge that Karen had destroyed. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. The following Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of someone violently shaking my gate and screaming at the top of their lungs. It was Karen, and she wasn't alone. She had about 6 other people with her, all dressed in matching exercise gear like some kind of suburban walking militia. I looked out my bedroom window and watched her grab the gate with both hands and rattle it while shouting loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "I know you're in there. You can't do this to us. You are blocking a public easement, and I am calling the police right now." The gate I'd installed was a simple wooden one with a latch. Nothing fancy, but it was clearly marked with no trespassing, private property, and smile you're on camera signs. The camera part was actually true. I'd installed a basic security system after the hedge incident. Karen kept screaming for about 10 more minutes. Her walking group looked increasingly uncomfortable as she ranted about property rights and easements and how I was probably not even from this neighborhood, so I didn't understand how things work here. Finally, one of her friends suggested maybe they should just walk around and use the regular park entrance, but Karen shut that down immediately. She said this was about principle, and she wasn't going to let some newcomer push around long-time residents. I got dressed and went outside to see what she wanted. The moment she saw me, she launched into a furious speech about how I was violating their rights and destroying neighborhood traditions. She demanded that I unlock the gate and remove the hedge so they could restore the proper access to the park. I tried to explain calmly that this was my property and I had every right to control who walked through my yard. Karen wasn't interested in hearing it. She kept talking over me, getting louder and angrier until she was basically shrieking. That's when she said something that really caught my attention. "I am calling the police and the town council and my lawyer, and you're going to be forced to tear down this illegal fence and restore our path access. You'll see how things work around here." True to her word, she called the police again. This time, 3 officers showed up, including a sergeant who seemed familiar with Karen. I got the impression this wasn't her first neighborhood dispute. I showed them the same documentation as before, plus the receipt for my fence installation and copies of the property markers. Everything was clearly within my property boundaries. The sergeant looked over the papers, walked the fence line to verify it matched the survey, and concluded that everything I'd done was completely legal. He explained to Karen very patiently that property owners have the right to fence their land and control access to it. The previous owner's permission for people to cross the property had no legal standing once ownership transferred. If she wanted to challenge that, she was welcome to hire a lawyer, but for now, she needed to stop harassing me and find another route to the park. Karen was not satisfied with this answer. She started talking about easement by prescription and adverse possession, and a bunch of other legal terms she'd obviously found online. The sergeant let her finish her speech, then told her that those concepts didn't apply to this situation and she needed to move along. After the police left, I thought surely this was over. Karen had been told twice by law enforcement that she was wrong and needed to stop. But instead of giving up, she decided to escalate. The following week, I received a certified letter informing me that a formal complaint had been filed against me with the town planning board. Karen was requesting an official hearing to establish a public right-of-way across my property based on 30 years of continuous use. The letter said I was required to appear at the next town planning meeting to respond to the complaint. It also mentioned that Karen had submitted a petition signed by 15 neighbors supporting her position. I was annoyed, but not particularly worried. I knew my property rights were solid, and I couldn't imagine the town would side with someone who was demanding free access to private property. Still, I decided to hire a lawyer just to make sure I had proper representation at the hearing. My attorney was a local guy who specialized in property law. He looked over my documentation and confirmed what I already knew. The previous owner's permission didn't create any kind of easement, and Karen had no legal basis for her complaint. He said these types of disputes come up occasionally when longtime residents feel entitled to use private property, but they almost never succeed. The town planning meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in a conference room at City Hall. Karen showed up with about a dozen supporters, including some of the people from her walking group. She had prepared what looked like a professional presentation, complete with printed maps and a timeline of the historic use of the path. Karen went first. She stood up at the podium and gave a 20-minute speech about community traditions and neighborhood harmony. She argued that the path had become a de facto easement through decades of use, and that closing it was harmful to families who just wanted to enjoy the public park. She made it sound like I was some kind of antisocial hermit who was damaging the community out of spite. Several of her supporters spoke as well, talking about how convenient the shortcut was, and how they'd been using it since their children were small. When it was my turn to respond, my lawyer stood up and presented the property survey, title insurance report, and deed. He explained that permissive use by a previous owner doesn't create any legal rights for the users, and that those rights were immediately revoked when I posted signs and installed a fence. He also pointed out that the town had no authority to grant easements across private property without compensation, and that doing so would essentially be taking my land without due process. The town attorney, who had been quiet through most of the presentations, finally spoke up. He said that while he appreciated the neighbors' concerns, the law was very clear on this issue. Permission to cross private property can be revoked at any time by the property owner, and 30 years of informal use doesn't create any legal obligations. The planning board voted unanimously to deny Karen's request. The chairman explained that they simply had no legal authority to force a property owner to provide public access across their land. Karen was livid. She stood up and accused the town of being in my pocket and threatened to take the matter to court. As she stormed out of the meeting, she made sure to stop by my table and tell me that this wasn't over. I thought maybe now she'd finally give up and move on with her life. Instead, she decided to make my life miserable in new and creative ways. Since Karen couldn't walk through my yard anymore, she decided to make sure I knew exactly how inconvenienced she was by my selfishness. Starting the Monday after the town meeting, she began organizing what I can only describe as the world's most passive-aggressive walking group. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., Karen would arrive with anywhere from 8 to 12 other people, all wearing matching workout gear and carrying water bottles. They would position themselves directly in front of my house, right at the edge of the sidewalk, and conduct what appeared to be a pre-walk stretching session that lasted exactly 15 minutes. This wouldn't have been so bad, except that they talked the entire time, loudly. Karen would lead conversations about how unfortunate it was that certain people didn't care about community spirit, and how the good old days were being destroyed by outsiders who don't understand neighborhood values. They weren't technically doing anything illegal. They stayed on the public sidewalk and kept their voices just below the level where I could reasonably call it a noise violation. But they were definitely making their point. Every single morning, I was woken up by the sound of a dozen middle-aged women discussing my moral failings at volume levels that could probably be heard 3 houses away. After their stretching and complaining session, they would begin their actual walk to the park. But instead of just walking normally, they had developed this elaborate routine where they would all stop directly in front of my gate, stare at it for several seconds, and then have a loud conversation about how sad it was that they now had to walk so much farther because of one person's selfishness. Then they would march dramatically to the corner, making sure to talk loudly enough for me to hear them the entire way before disappearing around the bend toward the park entrance. The whole performance took about 20 minutes and happened 7 days a week, including weekends. Karen had found the perfect revenge. She couldn't use my property anymore, but she could make sure I was constantly aware of her displeasure. And technically, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just exercising her right to use public sidewalks and engage in normal conversation with her friends. For about a month, I tried to ignore it. I started wearing earplugs to bed and playing white noise apps to drown out the morning commentary. I moved my home office to a room on the other side of the house so I wouldn't have to see their daily protest march. But it was impossible to ignore completely. Even when I couldn't hear them clearly, I could feel the negative energy. It was like having a dark cloud hovering over my property every single day. I'd worked too hard and saved too long to buy this house to let Karen and her walking militia ruin it for me. That's when I started thinking about a more permanent solution. The thing about being a landscape architect is that you learn to see property in terms of possibilities. Every piece of land has constraints and opportunities, and successful design comes from understanding how to work within natural limitations while achieving your goals. I spent a few evenings walking around my property looking at the area where the old path used to run. It was a narrow strip along my side fence, maybe 10 feet wide and about 20 feet long. The ground sloped down slightly toward the back of the property, and I'd noticed that water tended to collect there during heavy rains. That's when the idea hit me. I went back to the same town planning office where Karen had tried to establish her easement. This time, I wasn't there to defend myself. I was there to apply for a permit. The application was for what I described as an eco-friendly rainwater retention pond designed to improve drainage, support local wildlife, and enhance neighborhood aesthetics. I included detailed blueprints showing a naturalistic water feature that would collect and filter rainwater runoff while providing habitat for beneficial insects and small wildlife. The pond would be 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 4 feet deep at the center, with gently sloping sides lined with river rock and surrounded by native wetland plants. It would include a small recirculating pump to prevent stagnation and maintain water quality. The location I specified for this pond was exactly where the old shortcut path used to run. The permit application process was surprisingly smooth. The town planning office loved the environmental angle. This was exactly the kind of green infrastructure that looked good in their annual reports and helped them meet state requirements for stormwater management. The planning director was especially enthusiastic. He said the pond would be a great example of how private property owners could contribute to neighborhood environmental improvements. He even suggested that they might feature it in the town newsletter as a model for other residents. Within 2 weeks, my permit was approved. The final documentation included official stamps and signatures from the Environmental Compliance Office, the Drainage Authority, and even a letter of support from the local Audubon Society chapter. I scheduled the excavation for the first week in June. The timing was perfect because Karen's walking group had become so routine that I knew exactly when they'd be passing by my house. On Monday morning, they arrived for their usual 6 a.m. stretching session just as a mini excavator was being unloaded from a flatbed trailer in my driveway. I watched from my kitchen window as their conversation shifted from their usual complaints about me to confused speculation about what I was building. Karen herself looked genuinely worried. She kept pointing at the excavator and talking animatedly with the other women. I could see her phone come out several times, presumably to take pictures or call someone. By Tuesday, work had begun in earnest. The excavator operator started by carefully removing the topsoil and stacking it neatly for later use. Karen and her group stopped their walk entirely to stand at the fence and watch. I could hear Karen talking about property values and safety hazards and demanding to know whether I had proper permits. Wednesday brought the first official complaint. A town inspector showed up around 10 a.m. to verify that my construction matched my permit application. He spent about 20 minutes walking around the worksite, checking measurements against the approved plans, and taking photos for his report. Karen appeared the moment she saw the inspector's truck. She marched over from her house wearing a bathrobe and slippers, clearly having rushed outside the moment she spotted official activity. She started bombarding the poor guy with questions about whether what I was doing was legal and safe and appropriate for a residential neighborhood. The inspector was polite but firm. He showed her the approved permit and explained that everything was being done according to code. When she demanded to see the plans, he told her that the documents were public record and she could request copies from the planning office if she wanted to review them. By Thursday, the excavation was nearly complete. The hole was exactly the right size and depth according to my specifications. More importantly, it was positioned so that anyone trying to follow the old shortcut path would find themselves facing a significant body of water instead of a convenient walkway. Karen's walking group had abandoned their usual routine entirely. Instead of their morning constitutional, they were spending their time standing at various points along my fence, watching the construction and speculating about my motives. I overheard Karen telling someone on the phone that I was clearly building the pond just to spite them, and that it was obviously a safety hazard that would attract mosquitoes and probably alligators. Friday was installation day. The excavator operator carefully placed the waterproof liner and began positioning the river rocks that would create the natural-looking border. By afternoon, we had connected the recirculating pump and begun filling the pond with water. I spent the weekend working on the landscaping around the edges. I planted cattails, water lilies, purple iris, and native ferns to create a natural wetland appearance. I even added some decorative stones and a small bench where I could sit and enjoy the water feature. The final touch was a small solar-powered fountain that created gentle ripples across the surface and a pleasant trickling sound. It was exactly the kind of high-end landscape feature that my wealthy clients paid thousands of dollars for, and it looked absolutely perfect in that spot. Monday morning brought the confrontation I'd been expecting. Karen was waiting for me by my mailbox when I went outside to get the newspaper. She was trembling with what appeared to be rage, and her face was so red I was worried she might have a medical emergency right there on the sidewalk. "You did this to me," she said, her voice shaking. "You built that thing specifically to hurt me and my friends." "What thing?" I asked, genuinely enjoying the moment. "You mean my rainwater retention pond? It's for drainage and wildlife habitat. I'm calling it the gated garden water feature." "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "You know exactly what you did. You built a swamp in the exact spot where our path used to be. It's malicious and spiteful and probably illegal. Actually, it's a fully permitted, inspected, and approved environmental improvement," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the photos I'd taken of the completed project. "The town planning office loves it. They're thinking about featuring it in the newsletter as an example of private environmental stewardship." Karen stared at the photos on my phone, and I watched her face go through several different expressions as she processed what she was seeing. It wasn't just a hole full of water. It was genuinely beautiful. The plants were already starting to establish themselves. The fountain created lovely patterns on the surface, and the whole thing looked like something you'd see in a high-end garden magazine. "You have to fill it in," she finally said, but her voice had lost most of its conviction. "It's a hazard. What about children? What about mosquitoes?" "The recirculating pump prevents stagnation, so no mosquitoes," I explained cheerfully. "As for children, that's why I have a 6-foot locked fence around my entire property. The same fence you demanded that I tear down because it was blocking your shortcut." She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could practically see her brain working as she tried to come up with some argument that would force me to remove the pond. The problem was that everything I'd done was completely legal, properly permitted, and professionally executed. "This is about more than just the path," she said finally. "You're trying to ruin the character of the neighborhood. You don't care about community standards or property values or what longtime residents want." "I care about my property rights," I said. "The same rights that let me improve my land in any legal way I choose. If you want to discuss community standards, maybe we should talk about respecting other people's property and not demanding free access to land you don't own." Karen had no response to that. She stood there for another minute, staring at my pond and clearly searching for something else to complain about. Finally, she turned and walked away without another word. The best part about the whole situation was that my solution was completely permanent. Karen could complain to the town council, call the police, hire lawyers, or organize petition drives, but she couldn't argue with a permit. Every official agency had already reviewed and approved my pond. It was a legitimate environmental improvement that benefited the entire neighborhood. More importantly, it was impossible to walk through. The old shortcut that had saved Karen and her friends half a mile of walking was now occupied by 4 feet of water surrounded by marshy plants. Anyone trying to follow the original path would find themselves wading through a pond instead of strolling across a convenient walkway. The morning after my confrontation with Karen, I sat on my new bench with a cup of coffee and watched her walking group deal with their new reality. They gathered at their usual spot for their stretching session, but the entire dynamic had changed. Instead of righteous indignation about my fence, they were looking at a beautiful water feature that was obviously expensive and professionally designed. Several of them seemed genuinely impressed by the landscaping. I even heard one woman comment that it was actually quite lovely and would probably help with property values. Karen tried to maintain her angry commentary, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. It's hard to complain about someone's malicious intent when they've just installed what appears to be a high-end environmental improvement that the town government actively supports. When it came time for their walk to the park, the group had to face the reality of their new situation. The pond completely blocked the old shortcut route. There was no way around it, through it, or over it. They had to walk all the way to the corner down to the main road and back up to the park entrance. I watched Karen lead her defeated group around the long way, and I have to admit I felt pretty satisfied. She had demanded access to my property, threatened me with legal action, harassed me with noise complaints, and generally made my life miserable for months. Now she was getting exactly what she'd asked for, just not in the way she'd expected. The pond turned out to be everything I'd hoped for and more. Within a few weeks, I started seeing dragonflies skimming across the surface. A family of frogs moved in and began providing natural mosquito control. The native plants attracted butterflies and beneficial insects that improved the overall health of my garden. I even added a few koi fish, which turned the pond into a genuine focal point of my landscape design. Neighbors who had nothing to do with Karen's walking group began stopping by to compliment me on the beautiful water feature. Several people asked for my business card because they wanted similar installations in their own yards. The town planning office was so pleased with the results that they did indeed feature my pond in the monthly newsletter. The article praised it as an example of how private property owners could contribute to neighborhood environmental goals while creating beautiful landscape features. Karen's walking group continued their new routine for a few more weeks, but the energy was gone. Without the shared grievance of my unfair fence, they gradually lost interest in their morning protests. Eventually, most of them found other exercise routines that didn't require walking past my house twice a day. Karen herself still walks to the park occasionally, but now she has to take the long route like everyone else. Every time I see her pass by on the sidewalk, she has to walk right past my beautiful pond with its gentle fountain sounds and thriving wildlife. She can't avoid being reminded that her demands for access to my property led directly to a permanent barrier that's even more effective than the simple fence she originally objected to. The most satisfying part of the whole experience is knowing that I solved the problem using exactly the same legal and bureaucratic systems that Karen tried to use against me. She filed complaints with the town council, so I filed permit applications with the same office. She demanded that officials force me to change my property, so I asked those same officials to approve my plans for changing it even more dramatically. She screamed for access to my yard, and in the end, I gave it to her. The dragonflies love it, the frogs love it, the koi fish love it, and even the neighbors who aren't involved in property disputes love it. Karen, on the other hand, gets to walk around it twice as far as she used to walk through it. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. In this case, it's also having a permit. The next one is a malicious compliance story, so this actually happened a few months ago at my job. Long story short, coworker got promoted to a new supervisor position for all the wrong reasons. She's besties with the boss and gives him relationship advice on the side. Our team handles many types of incoming requests: phone calls, emails, tickets, and even printer jobs that get printed out automatically. We have a really chill system that actually works. Everyone helped where needed, and the manager trusted us to get the work done. Nobody tracked individual stats or micromanaged. We just got everything handled and kept things running smoothly, and it's been that way in this department for probably 30 years now. Then my new supervisor comes along and I guess decides she wants to tighten things up or increase accountability or something. Her big idea? From now on, I'll be tracking phone calls for performance metrics. Make sure everyone's doing their job and no one's slacking. So of course we asked, what about tickets and emails? Those take most of the time. She says, well, there's no way to measure those right now, so we can't really track that. Okay. So of course everyone does exactly what she asked. Phone rings, answer it immediately. If we were working on an email and a phone call comes in, put it on pause and answer the call. Working on a ticket, pause, gotta answer a call. So naturally, emails start piling up in the shared mailbox. Tickets sit untouched in the internal portal, which management still doesn't know how to run reports on. And the printer starts piling up paper in front of it. After a couple of days, people from other departments, people from our satellite offices, and even some of our external customers start emailing and calling asking if we're backed up because nobody's responding to tickets or emails. One guy even came down in person to ask why no one has reached out to him about the email he sent in. When asked what was going on, we just repeated what supervisor told us. Focus on the phones since that's what matters. A few days later, I saw the supervisor get called into a meeting with the boss. When she comes out, she's clearly annoyed and sends out a message on Teams saying, please remember that all work types are important, not just phone calls. And just like that, the performance tracking policy quietly vanished. We're back to doing all the work again, the same way we've been doing it successfully for years. The next one is an entitled people story. This happened earlier tonight, can't remember our exchange word for word, but you'll get the idea. I was going to grab food at a popular spot and the lot was filled. I went through one row with no luck, but then I found a spot in the next row. Next to the spot was some guy walking around his car with the back doors opened. I waited for over a minute while blocking the road. Luckily, no one came. But after he kept his doors wide open for that long, I decided to try parking, but I was way over the line. I rolled my window down and said, excuse me, could you close your door for a second so I can park? I've been waiting for a good minute. At this point, I noticed and should mention he had his little kids in the car, but that doesn't give him the right to a whole other parking spot. Then it begins. He immediately called me disrespectful and started saying he was a cop, which really ticked me off. If he wanted to take care of his kids, he could do it without blocking one of the few spots in a crowded lot. I was in disbelief at his reaction. He then said that there's plenty of other spots when the entire row and the one next to me was full and a couple cars were circling around looking for a spot. After getting very annoyed, I called him an idiot and flipped him off, which really got him going. He kept restating that he's a cop and was threatening to fight, saying crap along the lines of, come outside and we'll see. I wasn't about to fight over a parking spot with a male Karen, so I kinda just started trolling at that point. He was obviously pissed while I was just confused how this could be a real person. I haven't even had the chance to get out my car, and he tries to break my mirror by bending it all the way out, but joke's on him. My mirror does that without breaking. I jump out and take a picture of his license plate while he jumps in his car to leave and continues trying to influence me into a fight. As he's backing out, he keeps on idioting about me being an a-hole, and I was sarcastically saying that he's a great example for his kids and a great cop. Then he leaves. I find this whole situation pretty ironic with him saying he's a cop while threatening to fight and then leaving the moment he tries to cause property damage, and I get out my car. I realize I didn't need to curse at him and escalate the situation, but I wasn't just going to say nothing about his whack-ass reaction, and it was a good reality check to the fact that there's real people like that. I kind of feel bad that his kids are being raised by such a douchebag, but what can I do? Anyway, thank you for watching.